Chapter 7. A minor malfunction in secondary fire control has caused number 4 Hellbore's first shot to miss, requiring a second shot to complete target destruction. This is embarrassing but not critical, and has no significant impact on projected energy consumption. I descend at the maximum safe rate, however for my counter-grav systems are energy intensive, even with battle screen and main battery offline. Free flight requires no less than 72.66% of total power plant capacity. But without reactor mass, I have no power plant. And so even so a short a flight has reduced my endurance on reserve power to only 9.75 hours at full combat readiness, as I cannot replenish my power reserves until sunrise, which will not occur for another 8.86 hours. I must be frugal in future expenditures, but the shuttle's destruction has been well worth the energy cost. The enemy has lost a major striking force, and still, more valuably, the shuttle's commander's report to his mothership has provided me with much information. I have not only discovered the position of the enemy's main force, but succeeded in invading his comnet by piggybacking on the command shuttle's transmissions, and I consider what I have learned as I descend. I am not surprised by my ability to invade the shuttle's comnet. The enemy's obvious underestimation of the threat he faces has made the task even simpler, but a Kestrel-class shuttle's computers are totally outclassed of those by any Bolo, much less a Mark 33. What does surprise me is the ease within which I invaded the far end of the link. The AI of an Imperial Navy heavy cruiser, while not the equal of a Bolo, should have recognized my touch. It would be unlikely to prevent me from gaining initial access, but it should have detected my intrusion almost instantly and sought to eject me. More, it should have alerted its command crew to my presence, and this AI did neither. The destruction of the shuttles has terminated my invasion by removing my access channel, yet there's no sign the enemy even realizes I was there. I am puzzled by this, until I study the data I have obtained. The brevity of my access, little more than 12.32 seconds, precluded detailed scans, but I have obtained 5.23% of Melconian Cruiser StarQuest general memory, and what I find there explains a great deal. After over 50 standard years of continuous operation with an overhaul or refit, it is amazing that her AI continues to function at all. Despite all of StarQuest's engineers have been able to do, however, her central computers have become senile, and the failure of her AI to prevent or recognize my access was inevitable in light of its deterioration. Having determined the reasons for my success in penetrating the enemy's data systems, I turn to analyzing the content of that data as I descend past 9,000 meters. Rory Devereaux climbed shakily out of the bunker and leaned against the blast wall as he watched the huge shape settle to Earth. Its angularity combined with its sheer size made it look impossibly ungainly in flight, for it had no lifting surface, no trace of aerodynamic grace. Nothing which looked like that had any business occluding Ararat's stars, and the silence with which it moved only heightened its implausibility. But for all that, Rory knew what it had to be, and he swallowed as it touched down just outside the perimeter fence. It dwarfed the steading structures, bulking against the rising moons like some sort of displaced hillside, and for just an instant, it simply just sat there, a black, weapon-bristling shape, edges burnished with the dull gleam of dura-alloy in the moonlight. He stared helplessly at it, wondering what he was supposed to do next, and then jumped despite himself as the Bolo's running lights snapped on. In a single heartbeat, it went from the featureless black mountain to a jeweled presence, bedecked in glorious red and green and white like a pre-space cruise ship tied up to a dock in the middle of a prairie somewhere, and Rory drew a deep breath. Whatever else, that ancient war machine had just saved his steading and family from annihilation. The least he could do was go out and meet it, and he started the long hike from his bunker to the gate nearest their visitor. It took him 20 minutes to reach the gate. They were easily the longest 20 minutes of his entire life, and once he got there, he realized he still had no idea what to do. He shifted from foot to foot, staring up at the Bolo's armored flank, then froze as fresh light blazed from underneath the behemoth. It streamed through the chinks between the interleafed bogies to cast vast, distorted shadows over the grass, making him feel more pygmy than ever. And something inside shouted for him to run, but he stood his ground, for there was nothing else he could do. Wind whispered over the war machine's enormous hull, but there were other sounds as well, and his head rose as movement caught the corner of his eye. He turned, and his jaw dropped as an utterly familiar young man in worn riding clothes led an equally familiar horse forward out from the shadow of one towering tread. "Hi, Rory. Look what followed me home." I watched my new commander greet the older human. Their discussion allows me to deduce a great deal about both my commander and the newcomer, who I quickly realize is his brother, and I note both of their names, as well as their obvious affection for one another. Yet, even as I do so, I am simultaneously busy analyzing the data I have obtained from StarQuest. I am struck by the dreadful irony of what has transpired here. I remain ignorant of virtually all data concerning the presence of humans on Ishark, yet the parallels between their circumstances and those of Commander Tharsknar Makarn's flotilla are inescapable, and it is obvious from the captured data that StarQuest and her consorts can go no further. Whatever the enemy might prefer to do, he has no choice but to remain here, and he knows it. His initial and immediate move to eliminate the competing human presence was thus not only logical, but inevitable, as is the proper human response. The most cursory analysis makes that clear, yet I experience an unfamiliar distaste, almost a hesitation, at facing that response. In part, my confusion, if such is the proper word, stems from the unrepaired physical damage to my personality center and main CPU. Yet, there is more to it, for the reconstructed portions of my gestalt impel me in conflicting directions. They are repairs, patches on my personality which form pools of calm amid the complex currents of my life experience and memory. They do not belong to me, and the raw edges of their newness are like holes in the individual I know myself to be. I see in them the same immaturity as I see in many human replacements, for they are all unstained by all I have done and experienced, and in their innocence they see no reason why the logical, militarily sound option for dealing with an enemy should not be embraced. Yet those same patches have had another effect as well. I am no longer the Bolo half of Operation Ragnarok's Team Shiva, or rather, I am no longer solely that Bolo. In reconstructing my gestalt, CDC has reached back beyond Ragnarok, beyond my own first combat mission, beyond even the destruction of Terra, and it has pulled my entire personality with it. Not fully, but significantly. I am no longer a part of Team Shiva, for I have lost too much of my experience-based gestalt, yet I retain all of Team Shiva's memories. In a very real sense, they are now someone else's memories, but they permit me to see Team Shiva in a way which was impossible for me before my damage. And what I see is madness. I give no outward sign of my new commander and his brother, but recollections of horror flicker through me and curse my memory of its perfection. I do not simply remember events, I relive them, and I taste again the sick ecstasy as my fire emulates entire cities. There's a deadly allure to that ecstasy, a sense of freedom from responsibility, a justification for bloodshed and butchery. And it's not if it were all my idea. I am, after all, a machine designed to obey orders from a duly constituted command authority, even if those orders are in fundamental conflict with all the rules of warfare that the same command authority instilled into me. I tell myself that, for I cannot face any other answer, but the patched portions of my gestalt echo an earlier me not yet stained by massacre and atrocity, one for whom the concepts of honor and duty and loyalty have not yet been poisoned by hatred and vengeance, and that earlier self is appalled by what I have become. I sense my inner war, the battle between what I know must be done and the images of Melconian mothers and their pups exploding under my fire, between my duty as humanity's warrior and my warrior's duty to myself. Only the damage to my psychotronics has made the struggle possible, yet it makes it no less real, and nothing in my programming or my experience tells me how to resolve it. I cannot resolve it, and so I say nothing. I do nothing. I simply stand there, awaiting my new commander's orders without advising him in any way, and the shame of my frozen impotence burns within me. Tharsknar Markan looked around the briefing room and saw his own shock in the flattened ears of his senior officers. 3/4 of the flotilla's assault shuttles had just been wiped away, and none of them knew how it had been done. They should have. Tharsk's decision to land over the curve of the planet from the nearest human settlement had put whatever had happened beyond StarQuest's direct sensor horizon. But they had the telemetry from the original flight leader and his sexton's destruction. They knew what sort of weapons had been used. The emission signature from a Hellbore was utterly distinctive, but they had no idea how those weapons could have been employed so. StarQuest AI was of little help, for it was weary and erratic. Its need for overhaul so great, Tharsk had ordered it isolated from the general net 3 years earlier. In its prime, it had been able to identify human ship types by no more than the ion ghosts of their drive wakes, and analyze human intentions from the tiniest scraps of intercepted comm chatter. Now, all it could do was tell them almost querulously what they already knew, with no suggestion as how ground-based weapons could lock onto and destroy 26 widely dispersed shuttles flying at twice the speed of sound and no less than 100 meters altitude. Tharsk had become accustomed to the creeping senescence of his technology, but the chill it sent through his bones this night was colder than any he had felt since Sunheart's destruction, and it was hard to set that chill aside and concentrate on his officer's words.
It can't have been ground-based systems,
Darak Nakul was saying hotly.
The main formation was 800 kilometers northeast of Flight Leader Yuka's destruction, and Hellbores are direct fire weapons. Name of the nameless, just look at the terrain.
He stabbed a clawed finger at the map display on the main screen above the table. Its features radar map by the shuttle's flight to their destruction.
Look, right here, and here as well. These intervening ridgelines with crests higher than the shuttle's altitude. How in the fourth hell could a Hellbore shoot through a mountain to hit them?
The engineer glared around the table, lips quivering on the edge of a snarl. An answering tension crackled. Thars could taste it, yet he knew, as Dirac surely did, that the engineer's anger, like that which answered it, had spawned out of fear of the unknown, not rage at one another.
I agree with your analysis, sir,
Lieutenant Janal said finally, choosing his words with care.
Yet, I can offer no theory which answers your question. StarQuest's database was never well informed on the humans' ground systems, and some of what we once had on their planetary weapons has been deleted to make space for data more critical to the flotilla's operational needs. Nonetheless, all that we've retained agrees that humans never employed Hellbores beyond the 5-centimeter range as airborne weapons, while our telemetry data makes it clear that these weapons were in the 20-centimeter range. They thus must be therefore ground-based.
But, Dirac began, only to close his mouth with a click as Tharsk raised his hand. All eyes turned to him, and he focused his own gaze upon the tactical officer.
What sort of systems might we be looking at?
He asked quietly.
Sort of systems, Commander?
Janal repeated in a slightly puzzled tone, and Tharsk bared the very tips of his canines in a mirthless smile.
I don't doubt your conclusions as to the type and size of weapons, Janal. What I need to know is how mobile they're likely to be and how well protected.
He felt the watching eyes narrow and allowed a bit more of his fangs to show, expressing a confidence he was far from feeling.
We're here now, and our vessels are too worn to go further. If we can't run, our only option is to fight, and for that we need the best information on our enemies in order to employ our own resources effectively. Yes, Commander.
Janal's voice came out husky, and he cleared his throat as he punched in additional queries into the system. No one else spoke, but there was no real need for them to do so, for they knew well as Tharsk how thin their resources had just become. With the loss of Flight Leader Yuka's entire strength, they retained only 10 shuttles, 21 assorted light mechs, and enough battle armor for little more than a battalion of infantry. Aside from StarQuest's ability to interdict incoming missiles, that was all they had, and it was unlikely to be enough. Lieutenant Janal said finally, his eyes on the flat screen.
First, Commander, the humans mounted Hellbores of this weight as main battery weapons in their Type 1 armored personnel carriers and Type 2 light man tanks, as well as secondary batteries and most of their late model Bolos, in the absence of fusion power signatures on our flight, in which case we cannot face Bolos. And their light man armored vehicles should not have been able to coordinate their fires precisely as appears to have been the case here. Assuming the weapons were not in fact vehicle mounted, we are left with several types of support weapons which might fall within the observed performance parameters, but all are relatively immobile. That immobility would make it difficult for the enemy to bring them into action against us here, as we would be given opportunities to destroy them on the move at relatively minor risk. However, it would also mean that our shuttles were engaged by at least 2 defensive positions, since no support battery could have relocated rapidly enough to engage 2 at such widely separated locations. From the threat assessment perspective, and given that our shuttles were tasked to recon and to attack the smallest of the hostile emission sources, fixed defenses of such weight would most certainly suggest that the much heavier ones are for their more important centers.